So head of securities, when Dan Pickering and I started this company, he was head of securities, and then he moved over to do something different in our firm as it expanded. My kids were like, "You're head of security? So you have a golf cart and a blue light?" And sometimes that would actually be more fun than what I do when oil's falling. But so look, I have to be grounded in reality because I deal with the stock market every day. I can't look beyond 2020, and I'm going to explain to you why. So when you start talking about 100 years of supply, my eyes kind of gloss over because 5 and 10 year forecasts in natural gas have proven to be not just inaccurate, but just woefully, disastrously inaccurate. So when you think about 100 year, 50 year, 20 year, it's really, really hard. So for example, in 2000, and I'm going to catch this up, I got 3 slides I'm going to talk about. In 2007, we wrote that gas supply was growing in the US, and it didn't take increasing rig count to allow that to happen. And really, I'll show you, it's really arithmetic. There's nothing magic to this. You just understand decline curves and activity and add them up. But what I didn't realize was I had blasphemed at the Church of the Almighty Depletion, and that indeed it was a unanimous belief that gas production couldn't grow, and that folks, even these are smart industry folks. I had the CEO of a very large oilfield service company call me, and I'll shorten the conversation, but it was, "You must be the stupidest human on the planet to think this, and I don't know what to think of you that you actually wrote it down, printed it, and sent it out to all your clients." I said, "Well, walk me through where I'm wrong," because I was basic. It's just addition and subtraction. It's not hard. And he kept saying, "I don't know where you're wrong, but you have to be wrong." Right? And so you go through this circular argument, and finally he says, "I don't know where you're wrong, but I'm a member of Mensa." Now, I don't know if we're going to have the Mensa car pulled on us here during our debate, but the conversation was over because I don't know how to respond to that. And if you look to where we are today, we were wrong because gas production grew faster than we expected with a falling rig count, right? Because we found a couple areas called the Marcellus and the Utica, and I'm going to walk you through that, that have been materially better than the Barnett and the Fayetteville, and economically better than the Haynesville. And so if you look, I do want to point out the other part of this, even in micro terms. If you go back to April and or March when gas was $6.40 because some commodity traders got on the wrong side of the weather bet, everybody got bullish again on gas. God, you guys are so wrong. Gas is going to be great. The price is telling us gas is going to be fine. We're like, no. We're going to get to 3.6 TCF in storage by the end of the summer, or by November 1st. If you look, gas is 3.6 T's in storage, but how you had to get there, this is weekly injections into storage from April through the early part of November. You have just 10-year minimums. You have 10-year minimums, normal, maximum. And to get there, you had to inject at nearly 10 maximum injections every week that we've seen over the last 10 years. What's interesting, if you look at the maximum injections every week, every one of these weeks has a story to it. Something was down, this was going on, you had a hurricane, you had whatever. There was all sorts of, and we said, well, when we do the math, we think we can get there. So how did we ultimately get to 3.6? How did we ultimately inject at the highest, at effectively record levels every week for 20 straight weeks? It's because we're 3.5 BCF a day oversupplied relative to normal, and that's not because demand is bad. That's because we have a lot of supply. And until we see better demand, there's a lot of hope about demand out there, but hope doesn't make gas price go up. Right? The physical demand is coming, but the supply is already here. And if we're going to grow another 3 BCF a day next year, this time next year we're going to be 6.5 BCF a day oversupplied unless we have a lot of demand come in really quick. So when we think about this, I can't think about production levels unless we think about price. because price drives everything, right? So we have developed our own type curves. It's not that we don't believe what companies say, but we don't believe what companies say. And so we develop our own type curves. For the Bakken, we have, I think, 25 different type curves, for example. So this is an aggregation and a summary, but we'll have, these are kind of the basins we care about, and there's some sub-basins here. The graph on the right is break-even gas price. So this is basically how a company is going to look at the incremental gas well. This doesn't have F&D costs. This is just, it's going to cost $10 million to drill a well. Here's the type curve you're going to get. Here's the gas price required to make a 15% unrisked after-tax rate of return, not loaded with seismic, not loaded with land. He said, well, why in the world wouldn't you load it with land and seismic cost? Because the only gas companies don't. We're trying to understand what's driving incremental activity and incremental supply. What was interesting is it is dynamic. It's a relative ranking tool for us, but it also helps us understand when certain basins are going to kick back in supply-wise. We have the red curve is a January update. So earlier this year, we ran the economics, and we've just done a November update, and you can see you have certain basins where it was a little more expensive than it is now. So on average, you've got a handful of basins where the break-even gas prices come down. You have a couple basins where the break-even gas price has gone up. And that's just due to costs are changing, type curves are changing, right, in the various basins. So on average, costs are coming down, and that's not assuming that well costs come down over the next few years. But this is real basic stuff. You create a type curve, you stick it in a spreadsheet, and you do single well economics. But this is really important because I want to point you to, right, the Haynesville Tier 1, right, well, I'm going to show you the Haynesville here tends to be economic, or parts of the Haynesville at $4 gas. And there's a punchline to that, and I'll talk about it. This is our supply outlook, and we aggregate it through 2020, and I'm not going to make a forecast beyond 2020 because I'm not that smart. This is Marcellus and Utica. This is Haynesville. Notice the Haynesville's fairly flat through the forecast period. Here's Eagle Ford. Eagle Ford's growing. This is Gulf of Mexico. By 2020, the Gulf is basically just associated gas in our view, and then this is everything else. Everything else tends to grow a little bit. So there's puts and takes, there's declines, there's growth. But what this says is the real growth here through the end of the decade is driven by Marcellus and Utica. And this is the growth from the end of 13 through 2020. So it just shows you in absolute terms. In a more granular basis, you've got the Marcellus, Utica, Eagle Ford, Permian, so this is associated gas, Scoop, Niobrara, et cetera, and you do have rest of the U.S. is declining. You have Haynesville declining, and that's a key point. We have Barnett drifting lower, federal offshore drifting lower, and then a bunch of stuff that's kind of flat. We're running a $3.50 price through the middle of the decade, and then we get to $4 towards the end of the decade. And why is that? Because by 2020, we have 10 BCF a day of LNG exports. We have an incremental 4 B a day of exports going to Mexico. We have the coal sector is obliterated, right? The coal stocks are bankrupt. The only coal being produced is met coal. I mean, that's an exaggeration. The powder works, but Eastern coal is a disaster. So you have demand growth everywhere. But if you're going to see effectively 22 BCF a day of growth between the end of 13 and 2020, you got to have a lot of demand to soak that up. And I got 10 Bs of LNG, I got 4 Bs of Mexican gas. That means there's a lot of indigenous demand that has to occur in the power sector and the industrial sector, or gas prices are going to be really terrible. Now, the flip side of that is, if that demand comes, right, we have the Haynesville down, right? We have the Haynesville declining only because we don't think we need it. If we see more demand, if I were to make this forecast through 2025, I'd put gas price up to $4.50 and I'd have all the gas I'd need because the Haynesville comes up. Now, the single biggest uncertainty, and I'm going to finish with this. When we make our forecast, this is Aubrey McClendon made it was one of the best comments he made. An analyst had put together this massive production forecast where he hadn't constrained it with rigs or pipelines or anything. He basically threw lots of rigs at it and showed how much you could potentially grow production. And Aubrey's response was that that's a dangerous intersection of Excel and PowerPoint, right? And so we strive not to have that happen. So when we do our analysis, we have type curves by every basin. We look at how many wells we're drilling. We assume well spacing, and I'm going to come back to the well spacing issue for a second or in a minute. But we try to make sure we don't outdrill our inventory, which is easy to do in a 5 or 10 year forecast. So we're constraining our rig counts. So in certain areas, when we run out of locations, we turn it off and we move those rigs to a different location. Now what you find is by 2020, we're not running out of locations, but by 2025, there's certain parts of some plays, core areas where you might run out of locations, and you have to move into tier 1 or tier 2 acreage, which by definition is going to cause the price to go up to make those economic. So it's a real dynamic situation, and I think Richard mentioned it. There's a lot of talk. If you listen to what E&P companies are doing and service companies, they talk about pumping more sand. Bigger's better, it's a bigger hammer. Well, man, let me tell you something. The completions engineers are lapping the reservoir engineers because there's very little reservoir engineering work done on drainage area. And the Wall Street math is pretty simple. You have 100,000 locations, you have 100 acre spacing, that's 1,000 locations at 5 BCF a location, that's 5 T's a resource, woohoo, right? Did you follow that? That's how it works. The key there is, do you really have 100 acre spacing? If you're pumping 3 times as much sand today as you were 3 years ago, and 3 times as much volume, you're getting fracs that are a lot longer, and maybe your drainage area is 150 acres. And I did real work for a living before I started doing this job, and so I understand tight gas, the reservoir engineering behind tight gas, and what is occurring in the industry right now is not just sophomoric, it's not even college level, right? It is, hey, these wells aren't interfering after 90 days, that's the perfect drainage area. And I think going forward, as we think about the risk to a forecast beyond 2020, it's really what is that drillable inventory, or what is the drainage area of wells in various locations. It's counterintuitive. The drainage area in the good area, in the best spots, will be larger than the drainage area in the poor quality reservoir. And that's intuitive if you work tight gas, but there are a lot of people out here drilling wells who've never worked tight rock before. So with that, I'm gonna sit down and let the 100-year guys kind of fight it out. So.